My dad was lying face down on a stranger's lawn, arms zip-tied behind his back, the kind of plastic tie you get in a bulk pack at Walmart. Hovering above him was a woman in a windbreaker bedazzled with the words, "Compliance officer," screaming, "You're under citizen's arrest for mailbox violations." And the craziest part? He was smiling, calm as a summer morning, like being pinned down by a suburban vigilante wasn't even the strangest thing that had happened to him that week. That's when I knew two things. One, Wisteria Pines had completely lost its mind. And two, Karen Holstead had just picked a fight with the wrong man, a retired sheriff. 2 days earlier, I'd rolled back into the neighborhood in my beat-up Honda, tired from finals, low on money, and half-happy to crash at Dad's place while I figured out my next move. He'd offered, said I could stay as long as I needed. What he didn't mention was that Wisteria Pines, this quiet little cul-de-sac of pastel houses and picture-perfect hedges, had turned into a miniature dictatorship. Run by a woman with too much time and a clipboard collection that could fill a warehouse. My first red flag came the morning after I got there. A note, written in angry red pen and taped under my windshield wiper, greeted me with, "No overnight street parking. Violators will be towed at owner's expense. Code 4. 7 compliance check initiated." Below that, signed, Officer K. Holstead, Enforcement Division. It would have been scary if it hadn't been written on the back of a grocery store receipt. I showed it to my dad, expecting him to get mad. Instead, he just laughed. "Karen," he muttered, like that explained everything. Then he took a sip of his black coffee and went back to organizing his fishing tackle. "She's not even on the HOA board. It disbanded 3 years ago. She's enforcing rules from a book she made herself." He said it so casually, like it was just some eccentric neighbor with a quirky hobby. But then came the whistle. Not the friendly kind, like at a soccer game. This one was shrill, angry, determined, followed by a voice that rang out like an alarm bell. "Unauthorized trash bins!" I peeked through the blinds. There she was, marching up our driveway with a clipboard in one hand and a measuring tape clipped to her belt. She wore mirrored aviator sunglasses and the kind of smug expression you only earn by scolding cashiers and winning next-door arguments. My dad, meanwhile, was in the garage digging through boxes labeled 4th of July stuff, completely unbothered. Karen stomped right up to him like she owned the place and began listing violations. "Your mailbox is 2.3 inches too low. The lawn shows drought stress in multiple patches. And you failed to file a color harmony form for your flower beds." My dad just looked at her and nodded once. "You done?" he asked. That made her twitch. She wasn't used to being ignored. "I'll be back with the citation," she hissed. "And make sure your son isn't parked on the curb tonight." That night? My dad parked on the curb on purpose. And the next day, well, that's when everything exploded. He left the house that morning humming along to Led Zeppelin, off to grab some donuts. Meanwhile, Karen was already on the hunt. She tailed him in her gray SUV like a knockoff detective, complete with flashing lights duct taped to her dash and a fake Wisteria Pines Patrol decal on her door. According to 3 different neighbors, she swerved in front of him on Magnolia Lane, right in front of Mrs. Vasquez's garden gnome army, slammed on the brakes, grabbed a megaphone and screamed, "Step out of the vehicle! This is an HOA security intervention!" My dad, calm as ever, rolled down his window and asked, "Are you serious?" She shouted something about reckless endangerment and non-compliant window tint, then tried to yank him out of the car. Now here's what Karen didn't know. My dad is easygoing, sure. He avoids drama, keeps to himself, but he also spent 25 years as the sheriff of this county, so he let her zip-tie him, just to see how far she'd go. Later, he told me, "I figured it'd be funnier if she hung herself with her own rope." And she almost did, until backup arrived. Deputy Danny Martinez showed up just as Karen was radioing into her command center, which, to be clear, was just her husband Greg, sitting in a lawn chair holding a walkie-talkie. Danny stepped out of her cruiser, slow and cautious, like she was approaching a wild animal. Karen turned and yelled, "Back up, Arrest this man. He's resisting HOA compliance. Danny paused, looked down at my dad, zip-tied on the grass, powdered sugar on his shirt, and just said, Karen, what the hell is going on? Karen launched into a 10-minute monologue about neighborhood safety, mailbox height, and the visual harmony of Wisteria Pines. Danny didn't say much. She just knelt down, pulled out a utility knife, and cut the zip ties. Helped my dad up. Then, in the driest voice imaginable, she said, Karen, this is Sheriff Rick Turner, retired. Consultant to the county sheriff's office. Karen's face turned ghost white, then red, then purple. He parked the wrong way, she stammered. There's a code. There's always a code. There is no HOA, Danny replied. Not anymore. You're not allowed to pull people over, Karen. That's a felony. The neighborhood was never the same after that, but neither was Karen, and she wasn't done, not even close. Part 2. The Silence Before the Storm. The day after the zip tie fiasco, everything was supposed to go back to normal. My dad took it in stride, like he always did, joking that he hadn't had that much excitement since the meth lab exploded behind the bowling alley back in 2011. He laid back on the couch with an ice pack on his shoulder and said, Small towns, kid. You never really leave 'em. But something had shifted in the air, and not just around our house. The neighborhood felt different. It started subtle, a sort of stillness, like the whole cul-de-sac was holding its breath. Conversations that used to happen over fences now took place behind closed doors. People glanced over their shoulders more, walked faster, smiled less. Lawn chairs appeared on porches, all facing the street, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. And then came the silence. Karen didn't patrol, didn't blow her whistle. Not a single note or warning letter in sight. For a full 24 hours, she vanished. You'd think that would be a relief. It wasn't. When people like Karen go quiet, they're not surrendering, they're scheming. Sure enough, she came back, and this time she wasn't just holding a clipboard, she was holding a movement. Flyers started showing up in mailboxes, no stamp, just slipped inside when no one was looking. They read, Neighborhood Harmony Task Force, Informational Session. This Thursday, location disclosed upon RSVP. Dress code, business casual or higher. Attendance strongly encouraged. There were watermarks of an eagle perched on a picket fence. Dramatic fonts, capital letters everywhere. It had Karen written all over it. My dad opened the flyer, squinted at it for a full 3 seconds, then folded it in half and said, The lady's forming a cult, a very beige cult. I wasn't so sure he was joking, and I was curious, morbidly curious. So I RSVP'd, under a fake name, Josh Cranston. Made a burner email just in case Karen had some sketchy surveillance set up. The next day, I got a response. The location, the time, and a reminder. Dress to impress. You are the face of order. The meeting took place in the basement of the community center, which I didn't even know had a basement. When I arrived, 2 guys in matching khakis and navy polos stood at the door, both with security stitched across their chests like they worked mall patrol in a straight-to-DVD action movie. One held a binder. The other had a walkie-talkie and a look that said, I take this way too seriously. Name? He asked. Cranston, I replied. They looked at each other, nodded, and let me through. The room was dim. Rows of folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. A small projector screen flickered with the title slide. Operation, Order Restored. At the front stood Karen Holstead, dressed like she was about to run a military tribunal in a PTA blazer, over what looked like a tactical vest. Beside her, sitting stiffly in a metal chair, was her husband Greg, looking like a man who'd made a lot of poor life choices and didn't know how to undo them. About 15 people were in the room, mostly older residents. A few looked mildly confused. A couple looked like they'd just come for the free donuts. Karen stepped forward and began her presentation. And it was something else. She spoke in a tone usually reserved for public service announcements and weather emergencies. She referenced things like visual threat grading scales, architectural purity enforcement, and civic aesthetic compliance protocols. One slide showed a chart ranking house paint colors based on Serenity Index. Another compared mismatched patio furniture to civil erosion. Then came the map. A blown-up diagram of Wisteria Pines, complete with red dots marked across various homes. These, Karen said, pointing with a laser pen like she was briefing a SWAT team, are the violators, the non-compliant, the disruptors of peace. Her laser pointer landed dead center on one house. Our house. She didn't say my dad's name. She didn't have to. There are those among us who refuse to play by the rules, she declared, who invite chaos onto our very lawns. We will not let them win, not while we have binders and bylaws. There was clapping, not joyful, just awkward, like a middle school assembly no one wanted to be at. I slipped out before she got to actionable objectives. My heart was pounding. This wasn't just Karen being a busybody. This was Karen building an army. I told my dad everything. He didn't even flinch. Let her run her little cult, he said, flipping the TV to a ball game. The moment she crosses the line again, we drop the hammer. But I wasn't so sure waiting was the best move anymore. This wasn't HOA drama anymore. This was war. Part 3. The Gala and the Glitch in Her Kingdom. We couldn't wait. Karen wasn't just organizing a neighborhood club anymore. She was orchestrating a movement, turning lawn care into martial law. So Deputy Danny and I came up with a plan, not just to stop her, but to show everyone exactly who she'd become. It started with a camera, or more specifically, Karen's GoPro. She'd mounted it to her SUV during both run-ins with my dad, probably to gather evidence. A neighbor who once helped her digitize the HOA archives had copied all her footage onto a USB stick and, with a quiet nod, handed it to me like it was contraband. What I saw on those files was gold. We spent 2 straight nights editing. Zoomed close-ups of Karen's eyes as she shouted about mailbox regulations, dramatic music, freeze frames, a title card that read, Suburbia's Most Wanted. The final scene? Karen, waving her fake badge in Deputy Danny's face, while my dad lay on the lawn, zip-tied, powdered sugar on his shirt, completely unfazed. Now all we needed was an audience. Enter the Neighborhood Unity Gala, Karen's brainchild, a celebration of compliance success stories, held at the community clubhouse. Decorations included patriotic bunting, centerpieces shaped like topiary bushes, and a custom banner that read, Order is Beauty. She wore a tiara. Not a metaphor. A literal, sparkling tiara. Said it symbolized clarity, vision, and moral leadership. Danny and I rolled up late, dressed in borrowed tuxedos from her cousin's wedding stash. We didn't sneak in, we made an entrance. As Karen took the stage to accept the first annual Community Heroism Award, yes, she gave it to herself, I approached the AV table and plugged in the USB. Danny distracted Karen by asking a very serious question about fence stain regulations. The lights dimmed, and then it began. The room filled with Karen's own voice, echoing through the speakers. You are in violation of Community Code 12.6.1a, Vehicular Aesthetic Integrity. Gasps. Someone dropped a fork. On screen, Karen was zip-tying my dad, yelling about mailbox measurements, waving her fake badge, declaring herself chief enforcer of a non-existent HOA. At first, no one moved. They just watched. Frozen. Then came the murmurs. Greg, her husband, sat in the corner, face buried in his hands. One elderly woman whispered, "She cuffed the sheriff." Karen tried to yank the USB out of the projector, but Danny stepped in and gently moved her aside. "Let it play," she said. "Transparency matters." When the video ended, the room was dead quiet. Then came clapping, soft at first, then louder. It wasn't applause for us. It was applause for clarity, for relief, for finally realizing they weren't crazy, that Karen really had turned their peaceful suburb into a bizarre performance of HOA power run amok. But Karen? Karen wasn't fazed. She took the mic, smiled. That, she said, was an excellent dramatization. Very creative editing. But don't be fooled. The threat to this neighborhood is still real. And I will not stop until every garbage bin is precisely aligned, every lawn is within hydration code, and every driveway reflects community values. And then she dropped the mic, literally dropped it, and stormed out, her 2 security officers trailing behind her, looking like they'd just realized they weren't getting paid. The room stayed frozen. People didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And me? I felt something worse than victory. Because I realized Karen thought she was the hero. And people who think they're heroes, those are the ones you really have to watch out for. Part 4. The Tribunal of Tulips and Nonsense. The day after the gala, Wisteria Pines felt off. Not in a dramatic, fiery revenge kind of way. More like a before-the-storm kind of stillness. People were cautious, polite in weird ways. They put out their trash bins like soldiers lined up for inspection. Porch lights blinked on at exactly the same time. Nobody looked each other in the eye. Karen had gone quiet again, which by now we all knew meant she was up to something. My dad didn't say much about the gala. He didn't gloat, didn't even mention the video. He just sat on the porch the next morning, sipping his coffee, nodding at neighbors like he always did. A few gave him a thumbs up. One guy mouthed, "Thank you," like my dad had rescued him from a hostage situation. But Dad just muttered, "She'll come harder now." People like Karen don't back down. They double down. He wasn't wrong. That afternoon, we found an envelope taped to our front door. No stamp. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bold text centered like a court summons. "You are hereby summoned to appear before the Neighborhood Code Review Committee for a formal hearing on your continued noncompliance, misconduct, and behavior unbecoming of a resident. Refusal to appear will result in sanctions." Signed at the bottom, in a dramatic, swirly font, Chairwoman Karen Holstead. My dad stared at the letter for a second. "She made herself a committee," he said flatly. "Next thing you know, she'll be printing her own currency." I expected him to tear it up or light it on fire or tape it to the fridge with a sarcastic magnet. But no. He went into the attic and pulled down the real HOA binder, the original pre-Karen dusty old tome of actual neighborhood bylaws, the one nobody had touched since 2016. He spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table reading it like a thriller novel. Sticky notes, highlighters, mutters like, "Clause 7.3b, really?" And, "That's not even enforceable outside a petting zoo." When I asked what he was doing, he just said, "If she wants a hearing, she'll get one. But this time, we play by the real rules." The hearing was held the next day in the community clubhouse, which Karen had transformed into a low-budget courtroom. She'd hung blackout curtains over the windows, set up podiums, and built a witness stand out of stacked milk crates. There was a jury section, which, let's be honest, was just 6 of her closest supporters wearing matching polos and nervous expressions. Greg was there too, sitting in the back, looking like a man who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. The room was packed. Curious neighbors filled the chairs, some standing against the walls, all whispering like they were watching a live taping of Judge Judy, HOA edition. Then Karen walked in, wearing a navy pantsuit, mirrored sunglasses, and a sash that read, "Code Enforcer General." She slammed a gavel onto a dinner plate and declared the tribunal open. Her voice rang out, "We are gathered here today to review 7 violations committed by one Rick Turner, including unauthorized vehicle display, obstruction of decorative unity, and inciting neighborhood instability." My dad didn't even flinch. Karen launched into a slideshow presentation, yes, again, featuring photos of our trash bins with the lids slightly ajar. A garden gnome that had apparently toppled in protest. A picture of my dad mowing the lawn shirtless, which she claimed was aesthetic harassment. When it was my dad's turn to speak, he didn't rise dramatically. He didn't pound the table, he just opened the original HOA binder and started reading. Slow, calm, precise. He pointed out that the HOA had officially dissolved in a board vote 5 years ago, and all enforcement powers had lapsed. He showed that the decorative unity clause Karen kept citing was listed as a recommendation, not a rule. And when she accused him of inciting instability, he calmly pointed out, only one person has zip-tied another person in this neighborhood recently, and it wasn't me. The crowd shifted. Some gasped. Others giggled. Karen tried to interrupt. That document is out of date. It's stamped and notarized, he replied. She stammered. You're undermining this tribunal. You mean the one built with milk crates? He said, glancing at the wobbly stand behind him. Then came the final blow. Greg, yes, Greg, stood up from the back of the room, walked slowly to the front, holding a manila folder in trembling hands. He looked at Karen, then at the neighbors. His voice cracked. She forged signatures, created fake bylaws, bought the security shirts off eBay. I didn't say anything before because I didn't want to embarrass her. But this has gone too far. He placed the folder on the table and sat down again. Silent. Defeated. Karen's jaw dropped. Her mouth opened like she wanted to scream, but nothing came out. Then, from the crowd, Deputy Danny stood up. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a jacket, but her presence was enough to make everyone lean forward. We've reviewed the footage, she said, and if there's one more incident, just one more, there will be charges. Impersonating law enforcement, assault, coercion. Karen gripped the edge of the podium, and without a word, she picked up her clipboard and walked out. No final speech, no dramatic denial, just silence. And for the first time in months, Wisteria Pines was quiet and not the scary kind. Part 5. After the fall, before the peace. The clubhouse stayed quiet long after Karen left. Nobody moved at first. It was as if the room itself needed a second to process what had just happened. Then slowly people started whispering to each other in hushed tones, like survivors of a very polite, very beige civil war. Some left. Some stayed and lingered in small clusters, unsure if it was okay to laugh or cry or just mow their lawns again without filing paperwork. My dad? He stood up, adjusted his old sheriff's jacket, and walked out the front door like a man who'd just finished taking out the trash, both literal and metaphorical. I followed him, still half expecting Karen to jump out from behind a bush with a fake ticket or a PowerPoint clicker. She didn't. In fact, nobody saw Karen again for a while. In the days that followed, the neighborhood slowly began to return to normal, or whatever normal looked like after your self-appointed HOA dictator gets legally and publicly dismantled. People started talking to each other again. Trash bins were left out past 10 o'clock a.m., and no one screamed. Lawn gnomes popped up like mushrooms after a storm, defiant little symbols of rebellion. Greg, of all people, started building birdhouses in his garage. Told me he was thinking about opening a small shop in town. Even asked if I could help him build a website. I said yes, because honestly, I felt bad for the guy. Living in Karen's universe must have been exhausting. Deputy Danny and I started hanging out more. Coffee here, takeout there. Something about taking down a suburban tyrant together just makes dating feel earned. As for my dad, he finally retired for real. No more consulting. No more keeping an eye on things. Just fishing trips, backyard grilling, and classic rock echoing from the garage on Saturday mornings. It was quiet, peaceful, almost boring. And then the rumors started. Someone said they'd seen Karen 3 towns over, walking a tiny dog and wearing oversized sunglasses like a suburban fugitive. Another claimed she tried to start a new HOA inside a prison book club while visiting a cousin. No one could confirm anything. Until one afternoon, something appeared taped to our front door. Again. No stamp, no address, just a letter. Inside was a single page, centered in bold text. You are hereby summoned to appear before the Neighborhood Code Review Committee for continued misconduct and behavior unbecoming of a resident. No date, no time, no place, just a new signature. Chairwoman Karen Holstead. My dad held it between two fingers like it might be contagious. She's back, I said. He nodded. And she made herself a committee again. Great. I expected him to shrug it off, maybe laugh, maybe toss it in the shredder. But no. He walked to the garage, pulled down the HOA binder again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Neighbors started showing up, one by one, with their own notes, their own Karen stories, their own frustrations. Greg came, too. Quiet at first, then louder, determined. It was like a neighborhood support group, but with legal pads and coffee mugs instead of tissue boxes. That night, we didn't just prepare for another Karen stunt. We planned a response. Because what Karen didn't understand, what people like her never understand, is that power only works when people agree to play along. And after months of zip ties, citations, and fake arrests, the neighborhood had finally had enough. And that? That was something even Karen couldn't laminate. Part 6. The final showdown in cul-de-sac court. By the following week, Karen had re-emerged, fully operational. Her SUV reappeared, parked in her driveway at a precise 90-degree angle, not a leaf on the windshield. She wore the same aviator shades, the same windbreaker, and a fresh badge that now read, Chief Compliance Justice, Interim Emergency Authority. She was back. But this time, she wasn't just issuing flyers. She was staging a trial, again. And not just against my dad. She had a list. She called it The Reckoning. At least 9 houses had received summons, each printed on parchment-style paper, with gold-foiled borders and phrases like decorative sedition, driveway malpractice, and gnome-centric landscaping bias. It would have been hilarious if it weren't actually happening. And once again, the venue? The community clubhouse. But now she'd upgraded it. The blackout curtains were replaced with red velvet. The milk crate witness stand had been reinforced with plywood and, possibly, hot glue. Flags had been added. American flags. HOA flags. One that just had the word order printed on a beige background. Karen was going for Supreme Court meets PTA meeting energy. And unfortunately, she was nailing it. This time, she didn't wait for people to come voluntarily. She sent compliance officers, her so-called security team, still Greg and 2 other men who looked like they got lost on their way to a Best Buy shift. And yes, they tried to escort my dad to the clubhouse. It didn't go well. He met them at the front door, looked at the subpoena, then looked them square in the eye and said, "Tell Karen if she wants to play court, I'll bring the real book." And so he did. When he walked into that clubhouse, he wasn't just some grumpy ex-cop with a binder. He was walking in with the entire neighborhood behind him. Literally. People followed, curious, annoyed, fed up. There were strollers, lawn chairs. Someone brought cookies. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning of its own. Karen banged her gavel, this time a real one. She probably ordered it online with 2-day shipping and absolute certainty she was making history. "We are here," she declared, "to restore dignity, discipline, and decorum to Wisteria Pines. There will be no more chaos. No more unauthorized flamingo decorations. No more non-neutral fence tones." She motioned to her jury. 6 people who looked like they just wanted to go home and watch Wheel of Fortune. "Let the trial commence." My dad didn't even flinch. "Let's," he said. Then opened the HOA charter binder and began. He started with facts. Calm, precise, bulletproof. The HOA was disbanded. There was no governing board. Karen had no authority. No elections had been held. No official charter reinstated. He read the bylaws aloud, word for word, his voice steady, loud enough for even the back row to hear. Karen tried to interrupt. "This is not a real charter. This neighborhood is in emergency status. He looked at her. So you declared martial law because someone parked a little crooked? She turned red. That's mischaracterizing. No, Karen, he said. This is mischaracterizing. And then he held up a screenshot of her decorative Unity infraction ticket with Comic Sans font and a glitter border. Laughter broke out, the kind you can't suppress, the kind that fills a room with the sound of people waking up from a bad dream. But he wasn't done. He revealed evidence of forged notices, of neighbors coerced into removing flags, wind chimes, and patio umbrellas too expressive. He pulled out statements, signed by residents who said Karen had threatened to fine them if they didn't trim their hedges into geometric shapes. And then Greg stood up again. But this time, his voice was firm. She scared us into silence, he said. She made me feel like if I didn't back her up, I was part of the problem. I let it happen, and I'm sorry. Karen's mouth opened. Her hand trembled near her gavel. But then, Danny stepped forward, in uniform this time. She didn't say much, just held up an official-looking document and said, "We've got enough to file charges, Karen. Impersonation, harassment, fraud, it's all here. And unless you want a very real court to handle this, it's time to stop." Karen's eyes darted around the room, to the jury, to Greg, to the neighbors who had once nodded, once obeyed, but now just watched her. And in that moment she knew. It was over. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She simply picked up her clipboard, set it down on the podium, and walked out. No tiara this time. No badge. Just Karen. For a long moment no one spoke. Then someone, maybe it was Greg, maybe it was the guy with the cookies, started to clap. And the room followed. Not wild applause, not celebration, just relief. It was finally over. Part 7. The lawn is greener after the storm. After Karen left the clubhouse, the room didn't cheer. It exhaled, like someone had finally opened a window after months of stale, recycled air. There was no parade, no victory banner, just people sitting there, quiet, blinking, processing. Outside, it was a perfect afternoon, the kind of soft golden light that makes everything look a little more forgiving. Kids started playing again in front yards. Sprinklers clicked on. Someone down the street fired up a grill, and Wisteria Pines began to feel like a neighborhood again. Over the next few days, the changes weren't huge. They were small, gentle, but unmistakable. Trash bins started staying out past 10 o'clock a.m. Lawn gnomes multiplied with reckless joy. People smiled at each other on sidewalks again. Not the tight, guilty smiles of people who just got reported for a wind chime. Real smiles. The kind that said, "Hey, I see you. I'm glad we survived." Greg came by the house one morning, holding a birdhouse he'd built. "It's a start," he said. "I've been thinking of selling them. Maybe calling the shop the Gnome Depot." My dad chuckled, took the birdhouse, and nodded. "You build 'em. I'll put 'em on every lawn Karen ever frowned at." Danny and I kept seeing each other. Coffee turned into lunch. Lunch turned into late-night drives through neighborhoods that still had HOA signs at the entrance, half joking, half scouting for the next suburban dictatorship to overthrow. My dad? He truly retired. No more patrols, no more consulting, just fishing rods, classic rock, and the occasional deep sigh of a man who'd stared HOA insanity in the face and walked away laughing. And Karen? No one saw her for weeks. Rumors flew. Someone said she'd moved in with a sister 2 counties over. Another claimed she'd tried to start a new HOA in a retirement community and was immediately shut down by a 92-year-old with a hearing aid and a law degree. The last confirmed sighting? 3 towns over. A woman matching Karen's description was seen walking a small, angry dog and muttering about mailbox uniformity. Fitting, really. Wisteria Pines went on. It never became perfect. No place is, but it remembered. Every time someone tried to tell someone else how to trim their hedges or where to place a flag, there'd be a long pause, a glance at the mailbox, and a slow shake of the head, like a ghost had just walked through. Karen's legacy wasn't rules. It was a lesson. And every porch light, every slightly crooked garden gnome, every flamingo wearing sunglasses was a tribute to that lesson. Don't mistake a clipboard for a crown. And never, ever try to zip-tie a retired sheriff on his own lawn. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a woman who lost her mind over mailboxes. It was about a neighborhood that forgot how to say no, until someone finally did. And sometimes, that's all it takes. One person, one moment, one ridiculous powdered sugar-covered act of resistance, to remind us that order is fine. But freedom? Freedom is beautiful, even if your garden gnome's wearing a Hawaiian shirt. Part 8. The post-Karen era. A neighborhood heals, or tries to. You'd think after everything, the zip ties, the megaphones, the fake tribunals, Wisteria Pines would just snap back like a rubber band. But neighborhoods don't work that way. People, once shaken, don't forget overnight. Karen was gone. Yes. Her clipboards, her flyers, her decorative uniformity task force, all dismantled. The clubhouse was stripped of its curtains and fake flags. Greg even returned the podium quietly to the church where she'd borrowed it under community spiritual unity purposes. But trauma has a way of lingering in the hedges. Some folks couldn't quite relax. You'd see them peeking through blinds when someone parked a car too close to the sidewalk, or nervously fixing a flower pot because it didn't match the one across the street. It was like we'd all been trained to expect judgment at any moment, and now we didn't know what to do with the silence. And silence can be a weird thing when you've lived under a woman who made noise her weapon of choice. One evening, about a week after the tribunal collapse, my dad and I sat on the porch watching the sunset. He sipped his beer. I sipped my iced coffee. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then, out of nowhere, he muttered, I kind of miss the crazy. I gave him a look. Not her, he clarified. Just the clarity. When someone's obviously nuts, you know where you stand. It's the silence after that's tricky. You don't know who still believes in her ideas and who's just pretending they didn't. He wasn't wrong. That week, someone anonymously slid a pamphlet into our mailbox. No return address, no signature. Just bold font that read, "Structure brings stability. Stability brings peace." Inside were vague suggestions about restoring gentle oversight, nurturing visual balance, and returning pride to the pines. My dad read it, then calmly walked to the barbecue grill and lit it on fire. So, yeah, maybe Karen was gone. But Karenism, that kind of power lust dressed up as order, it doesn't disappear. It waits. It adapts. That's when Danny had the idea. We hosted a neighborhood forum. No rules, no agenda, just people. Talking, laughing, eating barbecue in the cul-de-sac like it was 1998 and nobody had a Ring doorbell yet. We called it Grill and Chill. Simple, non-threatening. No one wore polos with titles. People brought drinks, lawn chairs, stories. And at some point during the evening, someone placed a pink flamingo, plastic, smiling, sunglasses and all, right in the middle of the road. No one moved it. It stayed there. And that night, for the first time in a long time, Wisteria Pines felt free. Of course, the healing wasn't perfect. Some neighbors left, too tired of the drama or too embarrassed for having played along. Others stayed but didn't talk much anymore. But most of us, we rebuilt. Not with new bylaws or subcommittees or PowerPoint decks, but with tiny things. Cookies left on porches, shared hedge trimmers, unspoken nods at the mailbox. And when someone new moved in, someone from out of town who asked, "Hey, what's with all the gnomes and flamingos?" We'd just smile and say, "It's a long story. You'll see." And we'd watch. Because every town, every cul-de-sac has the potential for a Karen. And what matters isn't just standing up when she rises. It's what we choose to build when she finally walks away. So yeah, the grass is greener now. Not because someone ordered it to be, but because we're finally the ones watering it. Together. Part 9. Karen's Legacy and the Art of Prevention. You'd think that would be the end of it. And in most ways it was. Karen never returned to Wisteria Pines. Her house went up for sale about a month later, with a listing that included phrases like blank slate potential and motivated seller, make an offer. The photos were strangely sterile, like the soul had been bleached out of it. No one really wanted it. Eventually, a young couple bought the place. A music teacher and her husband, a guy who fixed motorcycles. They planted succulents where Karen's rose bushes had been and left a wind chime hanging by the mailbox. The first time it made a sound, a neighbor across the street flinched. That's how deep her reach had been. Karen hadn't just ruled the neighborhood. She'd rewritten its emotional reflexes. And undoing that took work. That's when my dad had his second great idea of the year, the Wisteria Pines Community Charter Rewrite. Not some fake HOA revival, not a power grab, a real open-source agreement, built together, voted on, no clipboard enforcers, just basic respect and clear expectations. He hosted a meeting on the same lawn where he'd once been zip-tied face down, powdered sugar on his shirt, listening to Karen scream about mailboxes. There was something poetic about that. People showed up, maybe 20 at first, then more. They didn't come with demands. They came with folding chairs and coffee mugs and potluck casseroles. And over time, we built something real. We talked about noise levels, yes, and garbage schedules, but also about what kind of neighborhood we wanted to be. Friendly, flexible, human. By the time it was over, we had a single-page document, not laminated, no Comic Sans, just this. We are neighbors, not enforcers. We lead with kindness. We speak before we escalate. We assume good intentions, and we believe that a little chaos is healthier than a lot of fear. Every household signed it. We framed a copy and hung it in the clubhouse. Not because we needed it, but because we remembered what happened when we didn't have anything at all, when a power vacuum let one very determined woman fill it with delusion and duct tape. And here's the thing, Karen wasn't unique. She's in every neighborhood, every office, every PTA and Facebook group and park committee. The person who confuses control for contribution, who masks insecurity with policy, who feels invisible until they're feared. So we didn't erase Karen from Wisteria Pines' history. We taught about her. At the next block party, a teenager wore a sash that read, "Assistant to the Regional Code Enforcer." People howled. Someone else dressed their dog in a windbreaker with compliance units stitched on the back. Someone brought cupcakes shaped like zip ties. It was stupid. It was hilarious. It was healing. Because humor is how we turn pain into memory, without letting it rot into bitterness. Greg came too. He brought birdhouses for the kids to paint, said he was working on a children's book called The Flamingo Who Followed No Rules. His eyes still carried guilt, but less of it now. He'd started over, in his own quiet way. Danny and I? Still going strong. She keeps threatening to write a memoir called I Cuffed the Sheriff, but he was cool about it. And my dad? He's at peace. Not just retired, relieved. The kind of man who's no longer fighting fires, just watching the smoke clear from his porch, fishing pole in one hand, coffee in the other. And every once in a while, someone new will stop by. Ask about the gnome army on the lawn. Ask why the community clubhouse has a code red karaoke night every month. Ask who Karen Holstead was. And we'll smile, take a deep breath and say, "Let me tell you a story."